Emerald Steel, Bucky Diablo took home the first Disney Lorcana Challenge of the set 4 metagame, 1,000 player tournament. We looked at all the decks yesterday from the top 64, but now, of course, I've watched a bunch of these decks, watched a bunch of the players. We're going to take a look at all of the different matchups that happened along the way, look at the different lists as well, talk about what I do and don't like from some of these and how I think the meta is going to develop from here. We're going to start off by kind of looking at the brackets, the top end of the brackets here. You can see that in the quarterfinals, we had Emerald Amethyst up against Ruby Sapphire, and Ruby Sapphire took this one home. Thomas, though, got took down. So you can see like a nice variety of different decks. We're going to focus a little bit more on some of the players that made the final. So Jordan Moore here was the runner-up with Emerald and Amethyst, and this deck was really fascinating. Of course, we're going to take a deeper look at it in a little bit, but really clean run, which really impresses me about the potential of this deck, beating Emerald Steel, beating Ruby Sapphire, and beating Sapphire Steel. That's like the triple threat. The 3 decks I put in the S tier of my meta report last week, Jordan was able to take down on their paths to the semi-finals, and this one in particular I think was a big upset. Brennan DeCanio in the quarterfinals, the top 8, was the last player on Sapphire Steel, and when myself and my friend Jan Moyen, who I was casting with yesterday, doing a little unofficial watch party, we both thought that Brennan DeCandio would be taking that one every day of the week, but it was a 2-1 win in Jordan Moore's favor. Emerald Amethyst, Jordan Moore was the 2nd seed from Swiss and made it to the finals as well. So incredibly impressive showing from that deck. But I do think if Brennan DeCanio managed to win that, they were probably the favorite for the tournament just based on the other matchup. So I think Sapphire Steel is absolutely still right up there, even though we didn't see it in the top 4. Then on the other side, we had Kurt Spies here, who we watch quite a lot of their games. They took down Sky, a very well-known streamer and friend of mine, on Sapphire Steel. That was a pretty tight match, but then very impressively, Kurt was also able to show us how it's done against Emerald Steel Bucky Diablo. That is pretty much the toughest matchup you can ask for if you're Ruby Amethyst, and we did see that matchup later on in the finals. Then on the other side, we had Zach Bivens, whose deck we are going to be taking a look at, losing in their first round game here, although it was actually the second round of the day. That top 32 is really the better way of saying it. We did see Zach Bivens on the stream actually take down a Ruby Sapphire player, which was really impressive, but not able to take down Alberto. Alberto, winner of a Mickey Mouse in Atlanta, but did lose to the eventual winner here in the quarterfinals. But if we take a look at Brian's run, also known as the Rat, they took down Ruby Sapphire, which is a pretty tricky matchup for them. I actually predicted them to lose that one, so that was a really impressive win. But then again, taking down Ruby Sapphire, so really impressive. I think Brian's tougher matchups were at the start of the day for them, and then they queued into Ruby Amethyst, which is absolutely the trickiest matchup for Ruby Amethyst and Brian's best matchup. After they played against Alberto in the quarterfinals here, they had an interview saying, well, I wouldn't mind playing up against some more Ruby Amethyst, and that did happen, but then the finals was certainly a much closer affair. And here you can see the semi-finals and the finals. We had Brian up against Kurt, and Brian did take Kurt down in the semis. And then in the other semis, we saw Jordan Moore absolutely and utterly aggro the Ruby Sapphire player in 2-0 fashion. It was as clean as you could possibly imagine. And then the finals, Jordan on Emerald Amethyst was the higher seed, but despite that, Brian was able to take it 2-1 in what was a pretty tight final. I think that game 1 where Jordan lost despite going first was really the key one in that. But overall, as well as Bucky did, or Brian at least, did manage to dodge the Sapphire Steel matchup, which is without doubt the worst one. I think we're going to see Sky, who lost to Kurt. This was a really big game, I think, for the tournament as well, because Sky's deck was so heavily teched to deal with Emerald Steel. They would have played Emerald Steel in the quarterfinals, which you imagine Sky would have taken down, and then they also therefore would have played up against Brian in the semi-finals. And again, deck so heavily teched to be beating these Emerald Steel games. So Brian, obviously Bucky and Diablo is a great deck. Obviously Brian is a fantastic player, but they would certainly agree that they had a pretty fortuitous run, certainly late on in the bracket, but clearly they showed that the deck was able to take down Ruby Sapphire, which is considered a pretty tricky matchup for the deck. So let's take a look at some of the lists then and talk about what we think. I have to say, I didn't really particularly enjoy watching the Bucky deck overall throughout the day. Every time there was the Bucky Diablo deck on the games were significantly less interesting on average compared to the other games. I just don't like the deck. It's the one deck in the history of Disney Lorcana which I think is a mistake. It's boring to watch. It's expensive. I think it's pretty difficult for newer players as well playing against it. It's a pretty miserable experience. It's very much limiting the amount of variety we're seeing in the meta. It's expensive as well. I don't think it's very difficult to pilot, while there's definitely some interesting decisions. And I think Brian piloted it very well, although they did miss a few Diablo triggers in the semi-finals. And that kind of shows you how strong the deck is, that you can literally forget to draw cards off Diablo and still win. That is pretty mind-blowing when you really think about it. But yeah. Anyway, let's move on. I don't think the deck is going to win Bochum, but I said that about this weekend as well. Zach Bivens lost in the top 32, but absolutely a deck to take a real look at because they were the first seed from day one in Swiss, and obviously was very, very close to making the top 16. We did see them take down Ruby Sapphire in what was a fascinating game. If you guys would like to see me post a video from Zach Bivens' Amber Steel deck and kind of analyze it more, maybe I could get him on the channel to talk about it. That is definitely something I'd be interested in doing. Two Cinderellas, and 3 Ursulas was the main question mark I had. But this deck was really designed in a way to beat Ruby Sapphire. There's a lot of tech cards in there. Pride Lands and Sleepy's Flute is the thing that obviously jumps out in particular at dealing with Ruby Sapphire. We saw Zach play Pride Lands on turn 2, maybe even another Pride Lands on turn 3 or 4. And then Whole New World, then finding the Sleepy's Flute just to cross the line. And World's Greatest Criminal Mind absolutely popped off. Obviously, there's big synergy there with the Queen, where you can buff up your opponent's cards to remove them with World's Greatest Criminal Mind. But also, the Ruby Sapphire decks just have so many targets for this. Maui, Maleficent Monstrous Dragon, Tamatoa, and now Sisu as well are all great targets for this card, which when it was printed in set 2, didn't have many good targets, but now it really does look pretty good, particularly with Tamatoa being also very popular in Sapphire Steel as well. I think World's Greatest Criminal Mind is a card to really take a look at in a Ruby and Amber deck as well, with Aerial and Beacon Undisputed as a control kind of tool. Maybe you could even play CP's Fruits in that starter deck. But Zach really showed us that Amber Steel Songs is still here and is still very much a real deck. Really interested to see if more people can have some success with Amber Steel Songs after this weekend. Good showing from Zach. Unlucky not to make it a little bit further. Let's take a look at the Ruby Amethyst decks, which made the top 16, which there was quite a few of. Ruby Amethyst is really utilizing the Flynn Rider Frenemy when going first. We saw Kurt masterfully play it again. I'm probably going to do some deck guides on each of these and show some gameplay from the stream, because I think Kurt really showed us how it's done. We saw them when going first try to utilize Flynn Rider aggression a lot of the time, but then when going second, playing this much more drawn out traditional Ruby Amethyst game plan. Now this one is very heavy curve in terms of only one drop with Chernobox followers. I personally would definitely like to see the Magic Brooms enter the mixer here as well. The Maleficent Sorceress is the card which is jumping out to me. This just looks a little bit too greedy in terms of early curve. If George doesn't find Chernobox and Flynn Rider, they don't play anything for the first 2 turns, which feels really dangerous, right? So they're going to be very much mulliganing aggressively, and then when you've got this very high curve of Tremaines, Medusas, Be Prepared, that could be a risk. I have to say, I like the heavy curve. I like the Tremaines in particular. It was Medusa you always play, but I'm really quite a big fan of the concept of playing Lady Tremaines and lots of copies of Bee King Undisputed as well. The Be Prepareds definitely popped off as well. I do wonder if you could maybe even remove them entirely and go heavy on the Bee King Undisputed, Medusas and Tremaines. Obviously with the bounce cards like Snakes, you can bounce the Tremaines back. Everyone that made the top 16 did play Be Prepared, but I do think it's something to consider down the line. Definitely the Maleficent Sorceress, the card that jumps out here. Magic Broom, and I would be a much bigger fan of this list. I think it's just a little bit too greedy in terms of the early curve. Again, you can't play Snake on 2 if you don't have a 1-drop, so I feel like this is just going to be missing an early curve too often. Let's compare it with some of the other ones. Well, Alberto has gone for 4 Pascals instead of those 4 Magic Brooms. Also has a couple copies of Cuzco and a couple copies of Crab. 3 being Bee King Undisputed, 2 Be Prepared, no Lady Tremaine. So you can see the lists are very, very similar. Moving on. And Alberto, bear in mind, got to the top 8, and Alberto is the winner of a Mickey Mouse from Atlanta. You did need the top 4 to get a Mickey Mouse in this one. And then we've got Kurt, which I think is the last Ruby Amethyst deck as well. So Kurt on the Brooms and the Chernobogs and the Cuzcos. Now, Kurt played this masterfully against the Bucky deck, where they just had some really, really interesting lines. Very, very aggressive in terms of making sure they had cards in hand on turn 3. They were trying to hard cast friends on the other side. They often weren't even playing the Flynn Rider through fear of it getting removed and that being one less card in hand to put in the inkwell. They just tried to get to 7 ink and then top deck a Be Prepared. That was often the game plan, especially when going second. When going first against the Emerald Steel players, they could be a little bit more aggressive, utilize Queen's Castle, but when going second, we really saw them just trying to get to 7 and top deck that Be Prepared. But that is a little bit of a hope and a prayer, isn't it? That you can get to 7 and that Be Prepared is going to be one of the top cards for them. And ultimately, they came unstuck. There was a turn or two when they did lose to the Rat. If they top decked Be Prepared at that exact moment, they would have won the series. So they definitely knew the outs. Again, I really love this build. I think that the Kuzco as well performed pretty well. It's just like an extra card draw tool. I don't like only playing 3 snakes. That's the biggest thing, which I would say is what I would absolutely always change about Kurt's list. I would always play 4. But I really love the rest of it. I would be really interested in seeing how the deck performs with 4 copies of Beaking Undisputed, 3 Medusas, 3 Tremaines, and no Be Prepared at all. Kuzco and Crab would maybe be the cards you would have to sacrifice for that as well to fit everything in. But something like this is very, very similar to how I would play the deck as well. And I think Kurt just played it so well. I was super duper impressed with the gameplay from Kurt this weekend. So big up to him. And yeah, moving on, we've got the Sapphire Steel decks. Now, there's 3 different Sapphire Steel decks we're going to look at in the top 16. Starting off with Sky, who is kind of the daddy of Sapphire Steel. Very much with a deck teched at the Emerald Steel matchup. And I have to say, I don't like the list. I really, really don't. Obviously, it performed well. Sky has gone for no Whole New World, but is also playing Mickey Mouse instead of One Jump Aheads and not playing Grandma Talas and How Far I'll Go. I feel like Sky just suffered a little bit from card draw. I will also say there was definitely some subtle misplays from Sky in the game that they did eventually lose as well. So this deck could have gone certainly further. The reason I say I don't like the deck is I just felt like it was lacking a little bit in card draw. You've got the Fishbone Quill, but then I think if you're going for no Whole New World, I would have liked Sky to have gone for Grandma Tala, maybe How Far I'll Go, One Jump Ahead instead of the Mickey Mouse, particularly if you're playing the Magic Brooms as well in it too. I think this Mickey Mouse could have easily been One Jump Ahead instead. But it was really interesting. I think the Hades performed very well from what Sky told me or tweeted out. The Aerial was great. The Tamatoa was great. Again, it just felt like it lacked a little bit in terms of card draw. Obviously, you've got Beast Tragic Hero there. And Sky ultimately did fall down to Ruby Sapphire, was it, that Sky lost to? It was Kurt on Ruby Amethyst. And that is really where the lack of Whole New World in the game that I did watch Sky play kind of stood out, right? Because it was open deck list at that point, and Kurt was just able to keep using friends, drawing a bunch more cards. Sky doesn't have any cards like Avalanche or Rise of the Titans in the mixer, which makes sense when you're not playing a Whole New World. But Sky just didn't have that threat of discarding their opponent's hand. I'd be really interested in speaking to Sky about the deck and seeing what they would change about it after this weekend. Sky has always been a player that does play Whole New World. Big credit to them for trying something different. Obviously, it worked well enough, and it could have won the whole event, I think. But personally, I would build the deck without a Whole New World slightly differently. I do think there's a lot of merits to not playing Whole New World, but I just think it lacked a little bit of card draw for my taste. And yeah, again, One Jump Ahead, Grandma Tala, How Far I'll Go seems like the better bet to me rather than kind of Mickey Mouse, Beast Tragic Hero. But anyway, yeah, moving on to another Blue Steel deck, Sapphire Steel. This one, Andrew Zhang, also got knocked out in the top 16. And this one does play a Whole New World, but it also plays One Jump Ahead. You can One Jump Ahead, obviously, into Tala or Flaversham. So you can go Popsicle on 1 Jump Ahead on 2, Flaversham on 3 is a nice little bit of curve. Know How Far I'll Go because, of course, the Whole New World instead. I do think, again, if you ditch the Whole New World, How Far I'll Go is a really interesting card. Beast Hard-Headed, a card I really like in these decks, particularly if you're on Whole New World. Good in the mirrors. 1 Let It Go. Only 1 Aerial would be my biggest criticism. I would like to see more copies of Aerial, but really nice to see Hades making a comeback. I think it's a really great card, and I think it's also sensible here that Andrew's got some location removal, also has Zeus, so very strong into these locations. I would have liked to have seen the 4th One Jump Ahead. I think that's the biggest thing that kind of jumps out to me, as well as some more aerials. But I really like this list, very similar to how I would play it with 4 Babooms with the Whole New World as well. really solid list. Definitely like the look of this one from Andrew. Up next, we have Brennan DeCandio, whose list, when I looked at it yesterday, said that it had a 3-cost beast, and it was not correct. It was beast hard-headed. I went in a lot and said something like, DeCandio deck building sucks, which was a little bit harsh. Because the beast hard-headed suddenly makes a lot more sense rather than this random 3-cost beast with resist. So apologies to Brennan for that mistake. Obviously, it wasn't on my end. It was just the deck list, which was made public, was incorrect. 2 Magic Brooms. I actually grew to like this card quite a bit. The more I thought about it, with the 1 jump ahead in particular, it is one of those cards which is pretty good at dealing with Diablo. Unlike Pegasus, unlike Corella and Jafar, like these 3/2 characters and 3/1 characters that cost 2, because it can't be removed by Let the Storm Rage On. So Diablo can often sing Storm Rage On, but Magic Broom can survive the hit. You can 1 jump ahead. You guys know my thoughts on Scuttle. I think it's absolute garbage. Would have definitely liked to have seen Smees as well, especially if you're playing Cogsworth. I think not playing Smee to play Scuttle is absolutely outrageous. 3 Smash, I guess, fearing the Diablo moving into the Cove. Zeus in there as well, which does make sense if you're playing Talas and Flavishams with 1 jump ahead. And the top end I like quite a bit as well. Maybe a little bit low on Aerials and Tamatoa for my taste. But does have 2 Let It Goes for some extra coverage. Overall, interesting list from Brennan. Definitely don't like the lack of Smees. I think that's the main thing that you guys are going to be unsurprised for me to say. But I do like the list overall. Definitely not as much. I like it a lot more than I did when I thought that they were playing the 3-cost beast. So yeah. Congratulations to Brennan on the top 8. I bet they're a bit sad that they didn't make it further. Losing to Emerald Amethyst, you would have to have thought would have been a really strong matchup for Brennan. They were going second twice, being the lower seed against their opponent. But yeah, I think if they won that, they were the favourites to win the whole thing. In fact, at that stage in the event, with 8 players left, Brennan was the person. In fact, I did pick Sapphire Steel to win the event before the event started, and I also predicted Brennan to make it through to the finals and ultimately get taken down by Ruby Sapphire, I think was my bracket prediction. We've got Patrick up next on Ruby Sapphire. So we've got some Ruby Sapphires to look through, and then we've got some Emerald Steels as well. So Ruby Sapphire Patrick in the top 16, not really too much to talk about here. Only on 3 How Far I'll Goes, which I know my friend Jan Moyen would not be happy with. This is a card that he really believes you should always be playing 4 copies of. 1 Judy Hops as the tech option. This one is definitely a really spicy list which made the top 16. This was the one which is very, very different, utilizing a lot of items. This is where I can get behind Scuttle a lot more, because you've really got a full item package where you've got 7, 10, 14, 17, 19 items. So your Scuttle's hitting like 73, 74% of the time, which is pretty good, to be fair. And Maurice's Workshop also gives you some more card draw. Aurora's also looking at the top and bottom cards, helping you look at the top and bottom cards of your deck on your items, which then you could make sure there's one there for your Scuttle to draw, so there's a bit of synergy there. Super fascinating list. I really do think that these more heavy on the item builds for Sapphire with all sorts of different ink colors could be worth exploring. Even like a Sapphire Emerald deck maybe with the hidden ink caster and heavy on uninkables is a deck I'm really interested in checking out. Not really sure there's that much to top end into because you don't have that board presence probably with Sapphire Emerald, but overall just a fascinating take from Ryan, and they did really, really well with it, so that's awesome to see. The Vitalosphere, we did see Queen's Castle giving Ruby Sapphire a lot of trouble, actually. We saw Queen's Castle from Kurt eat a Maui damage of 6 damage and then just staying on the board with just 1 willpower remaining for a good 3 or 4 turns. So the Vitalosphere being able to give something like your Sisu Rush, you play the Sisu, it clears the board, and then you also give it Rush and 2 extra strength to clear out the Queen's Castle in a single turn is really, really fascinating. And of course, it's good Flavisham fuel. With the Maurice's Workshop, it's also even more card draw potentially. So this is a fascinating list. I definitely think some stuff like this is worth exploring a little bit more with Sapphire. And like I say, even different ink color combinations with Sapphire, heavy on the items, is definitely worth exploring. Up next, this one is on How Far I'll Go. 1 Tremaine to be prepared. 2 ice blocks, not really too much to talk about there. And here is the 3rd place deck. This got absolutely aggroed out of it in the semi-finals. 3 How Far I'll Go, 2 Great Stone Dragon, 2 ice blocks. None of the 3-drop Sisu that is the uninkable, which is probably going to have given Tomash a little bit of hope, maybe, against the aggro players. Being able to remove a Merfolk pretty early on could have helped, but even then, it would have been a struggle as they were the lower seed. But yeah, very good performance for Tomash, and ultimately just taken down by the Emerald Amethyst player, which is, of course, actually still a deck we need to look at. So let's save that for the last. But let's look at the Emerald Steel decks. Flynn Rider looked really, really good this weekend overall. The Hidden Cove still in there as well. This one, Joshua Graham, who got to the top 16. We'll focus mainly on the winning deck. Prince John making an appearance with 2 Grab Your Swords as well there for Demetrius. That is pretty cool to see as well. 2 Babooms, which is, of course, an action card for Diablo to discard potentially to get that Diablo shift in there. I think Prince John's great. I imagine it's pretty good in the mirror unless it gets removed by Grab Your Sword. Then we've also got Dominic Couch, who made the top 8. This one with not too much of interest, 4 Sudden Chills and the 2 Grab Your Swords. And then finally the winning deck, before we look at the runner-up, which is the most interesting deck of the video, which is this Emerald Amethyst list. Brian Cortade, a.k.a. The Rat. 1 Baboom, which we did see them discard in the finals to shift in the Diablo. 3 Sudden Chill, 1 Zeus, and 3 Flynn Riders. We saw Brian a couple of times on 6 Ink play a Bucky and a Flynn, which was just really, really powerful. The one thing I'm unconvinced by in this list is the Zeus. I've never really been a huge fan of this card, but to be fair, when you're playing Jafar Dreadnought, you can sing it with Jafar, you can sing it with Flynn, you can sing it with Beast and Robin Hood. I just don't really see how playing this 1 copy of Zeus could be worth it over playing another copy of Bruno personally. That would be my one criticism of the list. The rest is super interesting, right? Like the Flynn Rider as a shift option for the Flynn. 3 Sudden Chills I also like, so you can really apply a lot of pressure. I really like the build overall. I think it's a really, really nice build from Brian. And congratulations to Brian's a player that's played Emerald Steel for a very, very long time. They also won a pack tier tournament at the end of set 3, playing Friar Tuck kind of stuff. And they stuck with Emerald Steel, and it worked out for them. But the runner-up, the deck I'm most excited to talk about, is Jordan Moore's Emerald Amethyst. And this was the 2nd seed in Swiss, and then came 2nd in day 2. So an incredible run from Jordan. It was a 2-1 defeat in the finals as well. And they were the higher seed, so they did go first twice. So they definitely had a really, really good opportunity. Now, any deck that you're really looking at in Decent Lorcana at the moment, in my opinion, needs to be able to beat Bucky Diablo, because otherwise, why are you really playing it? And Ruby Amethyst can beat it, but not that well, but it has really good matchups into the rest of the field. This deck does seem like, for Jordan, it is able to compete with Bucky quite a bit more. I mean, we can see here, it took down the 3 horsemen of the Lorcana meta, if you will, in Emerald Steel, Ruby Sapphire, and Sapphire Steel as well. And how is it doing that? Well, against Ruby Sapphire, we saw in the semi-finals, it just went complete aggro mode. Curse Merfolk, you guys know, is a card I absolutely adore. I also love Pegasus and Chernobog's Followers as 1-drop, as 1-drops for aggressive decks. Just incredibly powerful 1-drop aggro tools. You've got the Flynn Rider on turn 2 for some more aggression, which is also applying some pressure to your opponent's hand as well. No Prince John's Purple Dream in this one, unfortunately, but instead a Diablo is a really good threat. Being able to sing Friends, sing Mother Knows Best. And while you can't shift it in, it still just did cause some problems for Jordan's opponents throughout the weekend. If you can't beat them, join them. And also this Ursula Deceiver was really, really good against Emerald Steel. Being able to discard their Storm Rage on, their Strength of a Raging Fire, allowed Jordan to keep more questers on the board, allowed Jordan to disrupt their opponent. The kit Cloud Kicker popped off in a big way, bouncing back things like Ursula Deceiver, bouncing back things like Diablo. The Jacques is a fascinating card. When you play this character, chosen opponent character gains Reckless during their next turn, and it can quest for 2. So it's like an inkable version of Lyle Tiberius Rogue. Lyle slows down your opponent and doesn't quest for much, whereas Jacques slows down your opponent for a single turn, but then is questing more aggressively. Obviously, if you target the Diablo, it could be a pretty good option, because then the Diablo is forced to challenge. The downside of that, though, is that Reckless can be negated by simply singing a song. And of course, the Diablo decks have Strength of Raging Fire. They have Let the Storm Rage on very, very often for Diablo to be singing. So you could try and discard it with Ursula and then Jack the Diablo. Obviously, there's also Merlin Crab plus Pegasus to answer Diablo as well. You've got Mother Knows Best to answer Diablo as well, which is probably a card we've kind of been underestimating, really, as a early game way of removing Diablo. And there's a final way of dealing with Diablo, which is the Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell giving evasive to one of your other characters for the turn. And yeah, this deck just had so many clean answers for those Diablo decks. It's aggressive. Queen's Castle is also a real problem card often for these Emerald Steel decks to deal with. Very, very impressive showing. Also, 3 copies of that Ursula Sea Witch Queen as well, which is pretty interesting to see. Big up Jordan Moore. I do think that this deck could probably be played around with a little bit more and possibly optimized somewhat more. Like, I think 4 Queen's Castles is the main thing that jumps out. I would be interested to see if maybe more Cloud Kickers could be the way to go. More Mother Knows Bests, maybe even. I'm not sure. But super impressive performance from Jordan Moore. I really love the deck build. I think when I saw it, I wasn't too convinced compared to the other Emerald Amethyst deck, which made the top 64, which had Dolores's. But I mean, clearly Jordan proved me wrong. I think there was just a lot of cards here that I overlooked as being really clean answers to Bucky. I mean, the Mother Knows Best, the Tinkerbell, the Jack, and the Kit, as well as the Crab Pegasus, all clean answers indeed. So huge shout out to Jordan for a really, really impressive performance. Again, you can kind of see how this one played out here. If you want to take a look at any more of the deck list, they're all in the description. Overall, my feelings on the meta, I'll probably do like a full meta report later on in the week where I kind of show my own personal versions of the deck. For me, best deck in the game, I still think there's a top 3 with Emerald Steel, Ruby Sapphire, Sapphire Steel. Sapphire Steel for me would still be my top pick if I was going to play in a tournament. But I also think that now we have to give a real close eye to the kind of unknown quantities, which are Emerald Amethyst, which is the new kid on the block, as well as give a big mention to the Amber Steel deck as well, which is also a new kid on the block. Ruby Amethyst also with a very strong performance this weekend. If Ruby Amethyst can find a way to be a little bit better into the Bucky discard decks, that's going to be right up there as best deck in the game as well. And I do also want to give a special shout out to a couple other decks, which is Amber Emerald, as well as Steel Amethyst. Those are kind of the ones I've got on my own. Maybe Ruby Amber as well could make its way into the meta. The meta is still pretty wide open. Not as open as it was in set 3, mainly because most decks, there's not that many decks which can deal with Bucky. You're quite limited in your options, really. But yeah, meta's shaping around the Diablo decks. And I think that as the meta continues to develop, people are going to find the lines to be beating Diablo more consistently. And I don't think that Diablo Bucky will win Bochum, but I said that about this tournament and I was wrong. But again, I do want to highlight the fact that it was definitely a pretty favorable run of matchups for Brian after these first rounds here, because then, yeah, Ruby Amethyst again in the semis, and then a Emerald Amethyst in the finals. I think if you're Brian, you're going to take that every single day of the week. Not to take anything away from their achievement, but just to highlight the fact that it was a pretty fortuitous run for the Emerald Steel. And that kind of supports my thesis, which was yesterday. I would be surprised if Emerald Steel managed to take it home. Because, yeah, I think if it queued into like many of the Sapphire Steel decks, for example, it's a pretty tricky matchup indeed for the Bucky deck. But hey, it was still able to take down Emerald Amethyst despite going second. It was still able to deal with 2 very good Ruby Amethyst players and 2 very strong Ruby Sapphire players as well. And this is a matchup I don't think is actually usually favored for Emerald Steel. So big congratulations to Brian for the win, for all the players. Thanks everyone for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'll see you soon for more Disney Lorcana discussion, deck guides, meta reports. I've got paper gameplay recorded, and I also might just do some deck guides showing some footage from the Lorcana Challenge as well. I think Kurt's Ruby Amethyst gameplay would be really interesting to include in a deck guide on how to play certain matchups. Hope you guys enjoyed. See you soon.